welcome to our last panel of TPI Aspen. This has been such an incredible experience to be with you all. I've had great conversations on the side, got to even do a couple interviews with some of you, so I really appreciate you sticking around and being here for our last session. I'm Kelsey Griffiths. I'm a reporter covering the telecom industry for Bloomberg News, and I'm joined by a fantastic panel to talk today about the view from the Hill. We have a lot of topics to cover, so we are going to get started pretty quickly. I'm going to go ahead and introduce my guests here, and then we'll just jump into it. To my left, I have Thomas DiMatteo. He's the chief counsel to Senator Mike Lee, the Republican from Utah, and the Antitrust Committee chair. Next, we have Parul Desai, House Energy and Commerce chief counsel for the Democrats. We've got Edgar Rivas on the end, policy advisor to Senator John Hickenlooper, the Democrat from Colorado. And then on the screen, we have Kate Harper, the House Energy and Commerce chief counsel. Thank you guys for being here. So I want to start off by talking about everyone's favorite topic here in Aspen, spectrum policy. We're going to keep it nice and light after lunch. With the budget reconciliation behind us, I want to hear what you all make about the requirements of the FCC and NTIA having to find and clear these 800 megahertz of spectrum. How are you thinking about the requirements that were written into the legislation and how that is supposed to play out? Maybe we can start with you, Kate.
Absolutely, and sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but appreciate speaking to you all today. Well, first off, I just wanted to say that when Chairman Guthrie became chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee earlier this year, reauthorizing the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority was a top priority for him. So the fact that we were able to accomplish that in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was really a big accomplishment from the committee's perspective. The auction authority had been lapsed for over 2 years, so it was something that we were really proud to get done early in this Congress. Separately, the requirements in the bill, it's a lot. So going forward, now it's really up to the FCC and NTIA to start working with their engineers and making decisions on what spectrum is feasible to be repurposed and auctioned for commercial use. It's a big mandate, and so we plan to continue doing vigorous oversight of both the FCC and NTIA. There are going to be a lot of equities that need to be balanced going forward, and I imagine we will hear about it up on the Hill. But I think, at least for purposes of next steps, we will definitely be paying attention to what the agencies will be doing.
Awesome. Parul, I'd love to hear from you, since you and Kate are kind of counterparts on the committee. How are you thinking about these requirements?
Sure. I would agree with Kate that Ranking Member Pallone was also very supportive of restoring FCC's auction authority. One place where I will disagree with Kate on is that we were disappointed it was done through reconciliation. We had worked with, on a bipartisan basis, the last couple of Congresses to work on bills in a bipartisan way that would not just restore auction authority, but would then use those auction funds for things like NG911. But that being said, I think it's a good thing that the auction authority has been restored. I agree with Kate that we'll watch what the agencies are doing, but from Ranking Member Pallone's perspective, he believes that it's important for spectrum policy to be balanced, and so that we are hopeful that the FCC will continue to have a more balanced policy and not just make spectrum available for exclusive license use, but also for unlicensed use, for shared use. Ranking Member Pallone has always believed that an above-all approach is necessary to for U.S. leadership in wireless technology. So we believe in above-all approach, and we'll also be watching the agencies to see how they implement the bill.
Wonderful. Anything from the Senate side, Thomas or Edgar?
Yeah, from our perspective, definitely agree with part of what Kate mentioned, which is there's going to be a lot of equities involved in the next few years with developing this pipeline and identifying the bands that are feasible. I would encourage a few things that we think about. First, that we maintain cooperative relationships between federal agencies and stakeholders as these feasibility studies are being conducted. In the past, I think we've seen instances where parameters were agreed on the back end after a study was completed, and then you kind of have this chicken and egg scenario of disagreeing on the outcomes of feasibility studies. So I think maintaining the science as the North Star for spectrum policy is a really prudent policy I think we hope to see continued. I'd also mention too that a lot of federal agencies need to continue, performing their missions. And so I think one thing that we've taken interest in the Senate with Senator Hickenlooper has been looking at the Spectrum Relocation Fund and making sure that federal agencies, to the extent they need to recover costs to accommodate sharing or transitions to exclusive or whatever type of license model we use, that those costs are fully recovered. So I think maintaining that through an enhanced, modernized Spectrum Relocation Fund is important. And lastly, I'd say, I think tying all this together, there's an acute need for modernizing the radio frequency engineering workforce. So I think as we look at, developing this pipeline and identifying the bands, making sure that we have the engineering capacity to, continue doing that, not just now, but in the future as well, is important.
Fantastic. Well, I promise we're going to keep things super light after lunch, so let's talk about NTIA reauthorization for a second. I want to hear, maybe we can start with Kate. The House has obviously already passed a bill that would reauthorize NTIA, and it tweaks some of the ways that this agency would function. I'd love to hear what the sticking points are likely to be in the Senate, and also when we might expect to see the Senate take up a companion bill. Is that something you can start with, Kate?
Sure. So the NTIA Reauthorization Act was legislation that passed the House last Congress on a bipartisan basis, and then a similar version passed again this Congress, also on a bipartisan basis. So we were really proud to work with our minority counterparts in getting to an agreement on this text. I will say the legislation we think is extremely important to modernize some of NTIA's authorities that have not been updated since it was last reauthorized in the early 90s. One of the things that it does is elevates the assistant secretary to an undersecretary position. This is something that we've heard for many years is crucial for U.S. leadership internationally in the telecom space. In many cases, the NTIA administrator will go overseas and be dealing with cabinet level officials from other countries that are, whether they're Minister of Digital Affairs or whoever their counterparts are, they're significantly higher level, which does make it more complicated for the United States at some of these conferences. It does some logistical things like increases the authorization for NTIA to match the current appropriations levels, which is significantly higher again since it was last reauthorized in the 90s, some outdated reporting requirements. And then most importantly, the version we passed this Congress codifies the Office of Spectrum Management and the Office of International Affairs, both which deal with U.S. leadership and are crucial for U.S. technology in general. So I can't speak for Senate action, but I will say that at the end of last Congress, the bill that we passed this year reflects the conversations that we had with our Senate counterparts. So we are hopeful that there are no more sticking points and that this is something that will hopefully move through the Senate soon and be signed into law this Congress.
Edgar and Paul, I saw you both nodding while Kate was speaking. Do either of you want to add something there?
Sure. Kate took most of my talking points. So on this, we are pretty much in line with our thoughts on NTIA reauth. The only thing I would add is, as Kate mentioned, it's been over 30 years since NTIA has been reauthorized, and I think the work of NTIA has become just even more important over those 30 plus years. As most of you know, NTIA is the manager of federal spectrum, which in the last couple of decades has become especially important. Kate mentioned all the international work that we do, that NTIA does. They are now implementing BEAD. NTIA is officially the policy advisor of the president, and in the past, NTIA has been tasked with writing reports on AI policy, on privacy. NTIA also has some oversight over public safety and implementing NG 911 grant programs as well as FirstNet. So the work that NTIA is doing has expanded over the last 30 years. It's very important, and I think reauthorization would, it'll be important to reauthorization to acknowledge the work that NTIA is doing and the importance of its work.
And just two quick things I'd also add from the Senate perspective. I mean, just adding on to what Kate and Powell mentioned with NTIA, for those of you who follow cybersecurity policy and remember the software bill of materials, that actually originated at NTIA and then was carried over to CISA. So I think they do a lot of really fascinating research efforts that really kind of spill out into the marketplace. So that's just one example that I think ties into NTIA reauthorization. And I'd also mention, the last panel we talked a little bit about supply chain resiliency, export controls, maintaining resiliency in our communications infrastructure. NTIA also plays a key role in developing open radio access networks, and so that's something that has also been, authorized and appropriated by Congress to NTIA to carry out. So I think just, maintaining some of those research functions that NTIA performs would be essential, and so I think we look forward to revisiting that in the Senate.
Awesome. Well, Parul, I know you mentioned B just a moment ago, and we're going to get to that very shortly. I want to jump around, though, a little bit to talk. We've been talking a lot about telecom-specific issues. Let's talk a little bit about children's online privacy and safety. Thomas, I'd really like to hear how your boss's age verification bill for app stores is going and how you're looking to overcome some of this opposition from folks who say that individual apps should be shouldering that verification responsibility.
Thanks. So, as you mentioned, Senator Lee does have the bill that requires app stores to do age verification for children. Some of the parents groups and other groups have really championed, and some states have looking at this at the state level as well. The App Store is really kind of the gatekeeper to your phone, and in order to access any app, you have to download it. So it makes sense that the natural fit would be at the App Store level in order to verify someone's age, as opposed to at the app level, because that is the App Store is the gatekeeper to all the apps. So that's the logic behind the why. It also it puts the age verification in probably one or two companies, Apple and Google, who run the app stores, and it doesn't disaggregate it, so it does make it more efficient in that way.
And what can we expect next on that bill?
So that's a good question. It was reintroduced earlier this year. It's a little outside of my portfolio because it's run by our commerce team, and sitting on judiciary, I'm less close to that, so I'm not sure on the timing.
So you've done all you can at the moment. That makes sense. Great. Well, I want to turn back to another big topic in the telecom world, which is the BEAD program oversight. I'd love to hear from each of you, to the extent that you can address it, how your members and committees are thinking about NTIA's implementation of the state level grants, especially now that the Commerce Department has significantly refocused that program. Additionally, I'm curious if any of you can address SpaceX's recent challenge to Virginia's funding plan and any challenges that we might see in the way this mix of funding is being rolled out. Looks like you're ready to go, Parul.
I can start the conversation off. So I think this morning's conversation on BEAD was interesting. It was a little concerning, and I think it reflects, I think the concerns are reflective of our members' concerns, including Ranking Member Pallone's, that the new NOFO under this administration is not reflective of the statute's intent or what the program was intended to be. The goal of the law was not to provide the cheapest technology available, which is what I think what was being said this morning. The goal of the law was to give the states an allocation, a budget, and to use that budget to achieve universal service. The states are in the best position to understand the needs of the residents, to understand topography, to understand where it makes sense for a long-term investment. And so I think there is a concern that the current NOFO is not reflective of the law. And just some examples, the law requires universal service. The current NOFO allows providers to not serve all unserved areas, but the law requires universal service. The law defines priority broadband project, and it prioritizes technology that is the most reliable, the most scalable, and most capable of meeting evolving connectivity needs. The law does not say it's the cheapest technology that gets picked. The law says states decide what the low-cost option is, not the providers. The law also allows leftover funds to be used for non-deployment purposes and specifically mentions broadband adoption. So there is a concern that the implementation of the program now may not be consistent with the law. And one example I just want to give, I have not looked as deeply into Louisiana's Proposal 1 versus Proposal 2, but I know others have. And what others have gleaned from that proposal is the fiber build-out under Proposal 2 is less than Proposal 1, but the areas that are being left out in Proposal 2 are some of the poorest areas in Louisiana. And so maybe the administration doesn't think those areas deserve the infrastructure investment, but certainly Louisiana did. And so it's not clear to me that you know, the poorest areas are continuing to be redlined under this program, which I don't think was the intention of the program. It's not clear to me that if these are the poorest areas, that they will be able to afford the monthly service of a LEO service. And so the implementation of the program is going to have consequences, and I think these are not the intentions of the program. And so those are concerns that we are going to be looking at. And I would just say that the cheapest investment is not always the smartest investment. It's not always the best investment for long term, and I think we're losing a huge opportunity here that Congress gave us. It was a bipartisan law. It's an infrastructure law, and I think we could lose a huge opportunity to really close the digital divide, and ensure universal service.
Is there anything your colleagues from the other side of the aisle would like to add, Thomas or Kate?
I'm happy to jump in. I definitely understand Pat Rule's position on some of this. However, I think a lot of our members, I know a lot of our members actually had significant concerns with how the Biden NTIA was implementing the BEAD program. You know, one of the things that Pat Rule mentioned was that states are supposed to decide what technology gets picked. And we would totally agree with that. And I think that the new Commerce NOFO does allow that, and it is more technology neutral, where what we saw under the last administration, we were seeing the hand sort of put on the scale towards fiber technology, which certainly reduced any sort of option or very limited options for states to be able to use any sort of fixed wireless or satellite technology and to cover certain areas. So our members are definitely focused on making sure that all Americans have access to service when this program is done. But we also want to make sure that NTIA and the states are being responsible with the funding. The other thing that we saw under the Biden administration that I think has been correctly reversed under this administration are some of what our members have called the Biden broadband burdens. And one of those things was rate regulation. That was something that our members felt was extremely unnecessary, was explicitly prohibited in the law, and yet NTIA still was pressuring states in their state plans to rate regulate. So we are definitely planning to do oversight, and that is something that I will absolutely agree with Pat Rule on is crucial and will be crucial over the entire duration of the implementation of this program. But I do think that our impression and our members' view on some of the changes that have happened under this NTIA are that this NOFO really does comply more with what the law intended and allows states more flexibility. So it will take a little bit of extra time, but our hope is that in the long run, the funds go out and they can actually be deployed. One other thing that our members have been very focused on that we would love to work with our minority counterparts on, but it has not been bipartisan up to this point, is broadband permitting reform. It's been a huge priority for the Republican members on Energy and Commerce for many years now, and especially with $42 billion about to go out the door, the importance of streamlining some of these permitting requirements to speed up that deployment and get Americans broadband more quickly, that is going to be crucial going forward. So we'll see what happens there, but our hope is to advance legislation that would remove some of these broadband permitting requirements.
Great. Well, I think we'll go ahead and move on to a topic that all of you, I believe, expressed interest in to me when we were prepping for this panel, and that is network resiliency and I guess the future of the 911 system. I'm from Florida, as some of you might know, and so I am keenly aware that September doesn't just mark back to school season, it marks hurricane season. This time of year highlights so many telecom issues: infrastructure readiness, the 911 phone system, like I just mentioned, federal emergency alerts, just to name a few. So I'd love to see maybe, Edgar, if you could start talking about the priorities that your member is looking at in terms of public safety and how you'd like to see those addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I do, I just want to quickly backtrack to the BEAD conversation just briefly, because I do think it's important that as we're here in Aspen, we recognize that in Colorado's example, under our first version of the BEAD proposal, we recognize that we can't build fiber to the premises across the state. It'd be insane to do so in this mountainous area. So we had a mixed technology-based fiber, fixed wireless, satellite. So I think in addition to oversight, I think one thing that we are also looking forward to, that's also in the statute, is looking at the performance obligations on subgrantees, including LEO, and also looking at how NTIA decides to exercise any authorities for non-performance or deobligating funds in instances where it's necessary. We're still early on, and I think that's just one thing that should be mentioned. But public safety, I mean, it's a huge deal. So for those of you who might remember the Boulder Marshall Fire in late 2021, we had actually a really significant issue with the wireless emergency alert system. We had issues with geolocation accuracy, distribution, device compatibility, and interoperability. So we worked with the FCC, and they've iterated on numerous rulemakings and adopted reforms to improve the wireless emergency alert system. Obviously, I think there's a lot more that can be done and should be done, and I think that's something that is a very strong bipartisan priority on the Hill, is maintaining public safety communications. The other thing I'd mention too is that, as we're looking at, the future of public safety, NIST and FirstNet Authority and others are also looking at not just the X and Y axis targeting for when 911 calls come in, but also looking at Z axis. So if you're in a high-rise building, you're really refining the location of where an emergency might be happening. I think that's critical research. It's research that happens here in Colorado, and we hope that that continues. Lastly, I'd say, as we think about FirstNet and the reauthorization in 2027, there's a lot of equities involved, obviously, and I think there will be more conversations on the Hill on both sides of the Capitol on what the future of the FirstNet Authority looks like. Powerwell can speak to this as a former NTIA official, as can Kate. The organization, it's an independent agency within, or independent authority within an agency within a department. So organizationally, there could be reforms there that could be examined. One thing that we've seen here in Colorado is the transparency and collaboration with the Public Safety Advisory Committee. I think that's one that, as we've talked to stakeholders and as FirstNet has met its build-out obligations across Colorado in recent years, making sure that nearby jurisdictions that might not be opting in to FirstNet also have the interoperability and communication, and that any issues they see are addressed. So I think that's just one thing I'd like to start the conversation with, but I'll kick it to Powerwell or Kate or Thomas too if they have other thoughts.
I can follow up. I would agree with a lot of what Edgar said. What I would also add is Ranking Member Pallone has stressed the importance of also updating 911 and funding NG 911. So that's another area. I know we've worked in a bipartisan way on before, so looking forward to continuing to push funding for NG 911. And I would also just reiterate the wireless alerts have been huge. A huge advancement. I think there's certainly room for improvement, but I think the advancements that we have seen in alerts has been, I think, highly beneficial for public safety, and still room for improvement, and we'll continue to work on those issues.
Great.
I don't have much more to add other than FirstNet reauthorization and establishing that next generation 911 grant program are top priorities for our members. Our subcommittee chairman, Richard Hudson, led the Next Generation 911 bipartisan legislation last Congress, and we hope to work together with our Democrats again this year to be able to actually enact that legislation. And then similarly with FirstNet reauthorization, we are hoping to evaluate sort of the agency itself, how it's working, if there needs to be any improvements. And to Edgar's point, I'm sure there will be some discussion of the overall organization of the agency. And then finally, on the wireless emergency alerting system, that's definitely important. Hopefully the committee will be moving pretty soon on sort of hearing from people on the ground on all of these topics. Several of our members were personally impacted by the recent Texas floods, where the wireless emergency alerts played a crucial role. And I mean, I guess sort of all of these issues were involved during that disaster. So we hope to evaluate those very soon, and we look forward to working with our counterparts.
Fantastic. Well, I want to turn to another topic that has been making a lot of headlines on the Hill, and that is artificial intelligence. Recently, there was discussion in the reconciliation bill about potentially placing limits on what states can do in terms of AI regulation. Even though that ultimately didn't make it into law, We have seen the Trump administration since then implement a national AI framework that strikes some of the same notes. So I'd love to hear how you all are looking at and thinking about AI regulation going forward. Thomas, would you like to start?
Sure. Senator Lee is the chair of the Energy Committee, and for America to lead in AI, it requires us to unleash American energy. So in order to do that, it's important to evaluate regulations and look at regulatory reform initiatives in order to help American energy power AI so that we can be the best in the world at AI. I think more broadly, Senator Lee is a co-sponsor of the REINS Act, which is focused on regulatory reform, and it looks at rulemaking through the executive branch, and it essentially would require the House and the Senate to approve any major rulemaking done by any executive branch agency that has an economic impact over $100 million. And that would, that bill would really unleash and, help Congress legislate and sign off on what the agencies are doing through rulemaking, but it was also, I think through that function, we would also limit regulation and rulemaking.
One thing I'd say, just kind of building on Thomas's remarks about the action plan. I mean, I think there's stuff in the action plan that is to be applauded. I think there's security by design principles in the action plan. There's continuations of calling for more R&D for things like the National AI Research Resource, which had started under the Biden administration. So, there's also things about modernizing our workforce with upskilling and reskilling, not just for AI development, but also adoption, also data center build out and infrastructure. So I think there's things that, I think both parties can agree on. I think, I guess one sidebar on infrastructure, I do think there's an interesting point right now with this administration with respect to export control enforcement as we talk about AI leadership globally. I think these notions of, kickbacks to the U.S. government for sales abroad, or even early discussions about, takeovers of private companies and taking equity. I think those are things that are, certainly raising eyebrows on Capitol Hill. I'm looking forward to us coming back to session after Labor Day to kind of revisit these, I think, in closer detail. But, also to address what's going on here in Colorado, our legislature, as was mentioned in the last panel, we're coming back for special session. And our state has a lot to focus on, not just with budget, with healthcare, with taxes, but also with the Colorado AI Act. And what I can say is the federal delegation, our votes are in Congress, not at the state level, but that doesn't mean we're not closely watching what our legislature does. And I think I want to convey to this audience that there are conversations, right? I think that's a shared priority that everyone has here. And, whether it's things, focusing on clarifying applicability and scope, or things about, bringing back this notion of a right to cure, which Colorado used to implement the Colorado Privacy Act. I think those are all discussions that can be had and are being had. So we'll wait and see how the legislature resolves those issues. What I'll say at the federal level is that we do need a national framework, and I think part of the pitfalls with the moratorium, as was mentioned earlier, is that it was this notion of blocking states from enacting their own laws, including states like Texas, by the way, without any sort of federal framework to supersede that. And I think we really need to come together, both sides, and figure out what are the principles that we can agree on. Senator Hickenlooper last year at Silicon Flatirons, he was honored to speak, and he laid out a vision that I think still applies today. He called it a trust but verify framework, and it was really based on this notion of building transparency and content authenticity, developing a national data privacy framework, which I think has been mentioned earlier, that I think really can speak to a lot of these issues here that we see as well with AI. Building international coalitions, not just in the near term, but building ones that really promote interoperability, governance, fair competition, fair access. I think those are all things that we embrace. And we also introduced legislation with Senator Capito just recently called the Validation and Evaluation for Trustworthy AI Act, really focused on the notion of building on the NIST risk management framework, but looking at creating measurable benchmarks for how we do independent evaluations. I'll emphasize that's on a voluntary basis, but I do think there's a conversation happening on Capitol Hill where even last year, Senators Thune and Klobuchar, Senator Hickenlooper and Blackburn and others joined on the AI Research, Innovation and Accountability Act, which did set risk categories that we see similar but not exactly alike to Colorado and other state legislatures. So this notion that we can't be global leaders in AI but not also address risk, I think is a false choice. And I think, those are bipartisan priorities that we've seen advanced through the Senate Commerce Committee last Congress, and we hope to see that again this year with Chairman Cruz, and I think he's open to those discussions.
Great. Do we have anything to add from the House perspective?
The only thing that I would, sorry, Paul.
Go ahead, Kate.
Go ahead, Kate.
The only thing that I would add is from Chairman Guthrie's perspective, his biggest concern on any AI regulation is that we don't over-regulate the technology before it really has an opportunity to develop. So I think we're certainly open to having those conversations with our Senate colleagues, but I do think we have to be really careful about not over-regulating for trying to anticipate problems that don't exist yet, or even ones that do, and allow the technology to develop to address some of those before we sort of pass a law that stunts the technology's growth.
I don't have much to add. It falls a little bit outside of my subcommittee, but I can say when it came to the AI moratorium, Ranking Member Pallone did not feel that the state that did not feel that the AI moratorium was appropriate and thought that the state should continue to have the flexibility.
Great. Well, I'd like to turn now to talking a little bit about national security. The Salt Typhoon cyber attacks, which we were discussing in a previous panel today, emphasize the vulnerabilities in our telecom networks, especially those that were introduced by outdated equipment. So I'd love to hear from you all, what lessons have we learned from those intrusions, and how are your bosses thinking about who should take responsibility when incidents like this happen? This one's up for grabs, anybody?
I'll start here with just a Colorado-centric example and just share a few thoughts. So, we've discussed export controls, but with the Huawei issues and the rip and replace program through the FCC, Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, really many states across the Mountain West were ground zero for the states that needed to do the most ripping and replacing. So we've seen this firsthand that, we really need to think twice about how we maintain resiliency and continuity across our networks. One thing that I also think should be on Congress's agenda as we think about cybersecurity and major incidents when we come back after Labor Day is information sharing between the public and private sector. So for those of you who are tracking this, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act is set to expire at the end of September. And I think that's a really key issue that needs to be addressed urgently when we come back because, I think the government and the private sector work best with cybersecurity when we are situationally aware on both sides. And I think that information sharing authority is a key linchpin to all of that. So, there's certainly issues that I think we'll continue to learn as, the intelligence community, the Justice Department, the FCC, and others continue to investigate the Salt Typhoon attacks. But I do think that there are recent lessons learned we've seen here in Colorado that we hope, one, that we don't see them happen again, but two, that we kind of learn from our mistakes and are proactive in Congress when we come back.
I can go next. I would say, we've worked on a bipartisan basis often to try to pass bills that will secure our networks. We did that with the Secure and Trusted Act. We've had hearings just recently to discuss some of these issues. And I think what we've learned is there is a lot of outdated equipment, but I think all stakeholders in the system have a responsibility to keep up with the technologies and to ensure that our networks and our infrastructure is secure. And I don't think we should lay blame on any one stakeholder, but I think what we've learned is that there are vulnerabilities throughout the network, and all stakeholders have a responsibility to ensure that the networks are secure and updated.
Awesome. Kate, did you want to add anything, or Thomas?
I think it's pretty much been covered, but just to Edgar's point, I would say, especially with Salt Typhoon, the private public sharing of information, that really came to bear with that attack. And I think that is going to be extremely important going forward.
Wonderful. Well, I've got one more question for you all, and I think it's a great place to end this panel. Let's talk about FCC oversight for a moment. We've obviously seen a very active FCC this year with Brendan Carr at the helm, from the Skydance Paramount merger approval to letters investigating companies' DEI practices. How are you all thinking about FCC oversight? What areas would you like to probe? And is there anything that is top of mind for you going later into this year?
I can get started. I would say Ranking Member Pallone has expressed some of the many concerns that Commissioner Gomez mentioned yesterday. Ranking Member Pallone has written letters and put out press releases, but he is concerned, we are concerned that the FCC is making decisions and pushing policies based on entities that are favored or disfavored, not just by the administration, but by President Trump personally. We believe that there are investigations, often sham investigations. We've seen this with the news distortion investigation, equal time underwriting rules that some of the public broadcasters are facing. And oftentimes, even if there's no actual factual or legal basis for some of these investigations or policies, I think it is a form of intimidation that can lead to outcomes such as self-censorship, and the FCC essentially dictating business practices and employment practices because of the power it wields through its regulatory authority. And there is a concern that there's a certain perversion of what the public interest means. It often feels like the public interest under this FCC is really what is in the interest of President Trump or the administration, as opposed to what is in the best interest for the public at large.
Okay, I'd like to give your colleagues across the aisle a chance to respond to that too. Maybe Kate.
Yeah, speaking from the majority side, we have authority to do oversight over NTIA and the FCC. We've always been very aggressive on our oversight activities, both under the Biden administration, and we plan to do so under the Trump administration too, sort of on all of the issues that they cover. I think our focus will probably be different than our minority colleagues, but we can certainly commit to doing oversight over the FCC and NTIA this Congress.
One thing I'd say, and this kind of reminds me of 2 years ago when I was also fortunate to be here at TPI to speak on some of these issues, is the vacancies at the FCC, I think, are an urgent priority that should be filled. We've seen these vacancies not just at the FCC, but the Federal Trade Commission and numerous other independent agencies. And I think, regardless of the policy matter that's before any independent body, I think those bodies work best when they are fully staffed as they are intended by Congress. And I think this notion that fully staffing a commission or any independent agency is an option is concerning, and I think that needs to be urgently addressed. I think there's a number of very well qualified candidates on both sides of the aisle for any vacancy that could step in and fill and answer the call to public service and are willing to do so. So I think that's one thing that I think both parties should be embracing when we come back in September is looking at the nominations process and making sure that we have well qualified people serving in those two vacancies at the FCC.
Wonderful. Anybody else on FCC oversight? If not, I will go ahead and open the floor for any closing thoughts before we end. Anything to add here?
I'll just add, I think if you look at the Senate more broadly and you look at the Senate calendar, unlike the House, we have responsibility of going through the advice and consent process of the president's nominees, and that the way the Democrats are using the rules, that requires us to use floor time to advance President Trump's nominees. So I think you'll see the Senate agenda be nominee heavy for the next couple months.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for sticking around, and hopefully see you next year in Aspen. Give it back to Scott.
I most importantly, though, need to thank Jane Creel. I don't know that she's here right now, but everything that happened right is because of her. And you don't know the half of it. I would send her questions constantly that had no business being just didn't need to be answered, and I would get in the way. And so she did this really in spite of me. And Ashley Benjamin also, you may not have seen a lot of her because she was in the background making sure that a lot of the electronics worked and all of that. And Skylar Nunn, our intern helping out, and James Burrell, who I think who had to leave. We appreciate all that very much. And the St. Regis staff is always great to us. We're really happy to have them work with us, and the AV people. And we are already scheduled for next year, August 18th through 20th. Mark your calendars. I'm going to send out a survey at the end, 5 stars. And we even have the link up to register for next year. So if you've got some registration money burning a hole in your wallet, go right ahead. But again, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something and had fun. And safe travels. We'll see you next year.